The poison bread that fed the poor. Dark food history. Before food labels, before government inspectors, before modern laboratories, the most dangerous thing on a poor family's table was not always rotten meat. It was bread. The food that was supposed to be the safest. The food children were given first. The food workers carried in their pockets. The food prayed over, broken, shared, and trusted. But in crowded cities during years of poverty, shortages, and rising prices, bread could become something darker. It could be stretched, whitened, weighted, disguised, mixed with things that did not belong in a human body. Chalk, alum, clay, bean dust, ground bones, old flour, spoiled grain, and sometimes invisible poisons hiding inside the grain itself. To the poor, a loaf of bread was not a side dish. It was life. So when dishonest bakers, desperate sellers, and broken food systems began corrupting bread, they were not only cheating customers, they were poisoning survival. This is the dark history of the poisoned bread that fed the poor. Part 1, When Bread Was Life. To understand why poisoned bread mattered, you have to understand what bread meant. For much of history, bread was not one food among many. It was the foundation of the meal. In many towns, villages, and cities, bread carried most of the daily calories for ordinary people. A rich person could eat meat, cheese, wine, fruit, sauces, spices, and pastries. A poor worker might eat bread with onions, bread with thin soup, bread with dripping, bread with nothing at all. Bread was wages turned into something chewable. Bread was the measure of whether a household was stable. When bread was affordable, life was hard but possible. When bread became expensive, fear entered the street. When bread disappeared, governments trembled. That is why bread riots were so common in history. People did not riot because they wanted luxury. They rioted because the basic promise of society had broken. If a person worked all day and still could not buy bread, then the world had become impossible. Bread was also emotionally powerful. It was familiar. It smelled like home. It could be carried, saved, shared, dipped, dried, soaked, and stretched. A loaf on the table meant there was still order. But that trust made bread vulnerable. Because if everyone needed it, everyone would pay for it. And when a food becomes absolutely necessary, someone will eventually learn how to fake it. Part 2, The Economy of a Loaf. A loaf of bread looks simple. Flour, water, salt, yeast or leavening, heat. But in the old food economy, each part could become a problem. Flour depended on harvests. Harvest depended on weather. Weather depended on forces no farmer controlled. Then grain had to be stored, milled, transported, taxed, bought, baked, sold. Every step added risk. A wet harvest could produce moldy grain. A war could interrupt transport. A greedy merchant could hold back supply. A poor baker could buy inferior flour. A desperate baker could stretch flour with cheaper materials. And a starving customer might not have the power to choose better. This is where adulteration begins. Not always with evil in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it begins with pressure. Flour prices rise. Customers demand cheap bread. Bakers fear losing business. Officials demand fixed loaf sizes. Profits shrink. So the bread is quietly changed. A little less real flour, a little more filler, a little chemical whitening, a little substance to make dough look stronger than it is. At first, maybe no one notices. Then the trick becomes normal. And then the food of the poor becomes a laboratory of survival and fraud. Part 3, The White Bread Problem. For centuries, white bread was associated with status. Dark bread was for the poor. Coarse bread was for workers. Bread full of bran, husks, and hard grains was seen as lower. White bread suggested refinement. It suggested clean flour, better milling, higher price, and a table above desperation. That made whiteness profitable. If customers wanted white bread, sellers had a reason to make bread appear whiter than it really was. Some substances could bleach or brighten flour. Others could improve the look of low-quality bread. Some could help weak flour hold shape, and some could add weight. Because bread was sold by size and weight, a heavier loaf could be sold as more valuable, even if that weight came from something useless or harmful. Imagine a poor mother in a city market. She has only a few coins. She chooses a loaf that looks pale, large, and respectable. It seems like a victory. Enough bread for children, enough bread for soup, enough bread to last one more day. But the loaf may not be what it appears. The whiteness may be false. The weight may be false. The nourishment may be false. And the danger may be real. This is one of the cruelest parts of food fraud. It often targets hope. It offers the appearance of abundance to people who can least afford deception. Part 4, When Fillers Enter the Dough. In hard times, bread could be extended with many things. Some were merely inferior. Some were unpleasant. Some were dangerous. Bean flour, pea flour, bran, husks, potato meal, ground acorns. These could stretch bread and sometimes provide nutrition. though the taste and texture changed. But other materials were less innocent. Chalk could whiten and add weight. Clay could bulk out flour. Ground bone could add substance. Old, musty, or contaminated grain could be milled and hidden inside a loaf. In famine conditions, even sawdust, straw, or bark could appear in breads of desperation. Not every strange ingredient was fraud. Sometimes a family knowingly used bark or acorns because there was no other choice. But in the marketplace, the danger was deception. The buyer did not always know. The seller did, and the poor body paid the price. A loaf stretched with useless filler might fill the stomach while starving the person. A loaf made from bad grain might spread illness. A loaf treated with chemicals might damage digestion or worse. Bread could become a false promise. It looked like food. It smelled like food. It sat on the table like food. But inside, it carried the logic of a broken system. Make it look bigger. Make it look whiter. Make it sell. And let the hungry discover the truth too late. Part 5, ergot, mold, and the grain that turned against people. Not all poisoned bread came from human fraud. Sometimes the poison came from the field. Rye and other grains could be infected by ergot, a fungus that replaces grain kernels with dark toxic bodies. When contaminated grain was milled into flour, the poison entered bread. The results could be terrifying. Burning sensations, convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, pain that people once struggled to explain. In communities without modern microbiology, poisoned grain could look like a curse, a punishment, a supernatural attack. People ate bread because bread was necessary, and then the bread seemed to attack them from within. The horror of ergot reminds us that food safety is not only about honesty, it is also about knowledge. A farmer might harvest grain that looks strange but still usable. A miller might grind it. A baker might bake it. A family might eat it. And the chain of survival became a chain of poisoning. During scarcity, people are less able to reject questionable food. In abundance, a suspicious sack of grain can be thrown away. In famine, throwing away grain can feel like throwing away life. So the poor often ate risk because hunger gave them no clean alternative. This is a recurring law of dark food history. Dangerous food does not need to be attractive. It only needs to be available. Part 6, the city that could not trust its bread. As cities grew, people became more dependent on strangers for food. A village family might know the field, the mill, and the oven. A city worker often knew only the shop. Urban life created distance between eaters and ingredients. That distance created opportunity. Who really knew what was in the flour? Who inspected the mill? Who watched the baker before dawn? Who tested the loaf? Who protected a customer too poor to complain? Food fraud flourished in the shadows between hunger and trust. And bread was the perfect vehicle. Once ingredients were ground together, the evidence disappeared. Clay became dust. Chalk became whiteness. Bad grain became flour. Fillers became dough. The oven transformed everything into one object. A loaf can hide a crime better than almost any food. It is sealed by heat, smoothed by crust, blessed by familiarity, placed in the hands of the hungry. That is why the fight for pure bread became part of the larger fight for food regulation. Inspectors, public health laws, standards, adulteration acts, urban testing. These did not appear because society suddenly became kind. They appeared because industrial food had become too complex and too dangerous to leave entirely to trust. Part 7, the morality of a loaf. It is easy to imagine the dishonest baker as a villain. And sometimes that is exactly what he was. A person who knowingly sold harmful bread to the hungry committed a deep betrayal. But dark food history is rarely simple. The baker might also be trapped. Flour prices rise. Customers demand cheap loaves. Authorities set rules. Rent must be paid. Competitors cheat. If one baker sells honest bread at a higher price, customers may leave. If another sells fake bread cheaply, he survives. The system begins rewarding deception. This does not excuse poisoning, but it explains how ordinary economies can produce extraordinary cruelty. When survival food becomes a commodity, hunger becomes a market. And when hunger becomes a market, the poorest customers often become the easiest victims. The poison loaf is not only about chemistry, it is about power. The person who buys bread needs it immediately. The person who sells bread controls what is hidden inside. The poor must trust. The seller may exploit. And the body becomes the place where the truth is revealed. Part 8, the children who ate first. At the family table, bread fraud became personal. A mother did not divide an abstract economic product. She divided breakfast. She gave the first piece to a child. She soaked stale bread in water to soften it. She stretched crumbs into soup. She saved crusts. She pretended she had already eaten. If the bread was weak, the child weakened. If the bread was contaminated, the child suffered. If the bread was mostly filler, the family might feel full and still starve. This is the quiet violence of adulterated food. It does not always kill immediately. Sometimes it steals strength slowly. A little less nourishment each day. a little more stomach pain, a little more vulnerability to cold and disease. A worker cannot work as hard. A child cannot grow as well. A sick person cannot recover. The loaf sits in the center of the table like stability, but it may be carrying decline. When we talk about poisoned bread, we are not only talking about dramatic poisonings, we are talking about the theft of nutrition from those who had almost none to spare. Part 9. Why pure food became a modern obsession. Modern food safety was not born from comfort. It was born from fear. Fear of watered milk, fear of fake coffee, fear of contaminated meat, fear of colored sweets, fear of bread that was not truly bread. As science advanced, societies gained new tools to detect what the eye could not see. Chemists could test flour. Inspectors could examine bakeries. Laws could punish adulteration. Public campaigns could warn consumers. But even then, regulation was a struggle. Industry resisted. Fraud adapted. Consumers still wanted cheap food. And the poor still faced the hardest trade-off. Pure food often costs more. Cheap food often hides risk. That tension has never fully disappeared. Today, food labels are longer. Supply chains are more complex. Ingredients travel across continents. Most bread is far safer than it was in the age of open adulteration. But the deeper question remains. Can ordinary people trust the food systems they depend on? The poisoned bread of the past reminds us that trust must be built, inspected, tested, and defended. Because hunger makes people vulnerable. And vulnerable people deserve protection, not deception. Part 10. What a loaf remembers. Bread looks humble, but it remembers civilization. It remembers fields, mills, ovens, markets, labor, law, trust. A loaf is a contract between many strangers. The farmer promises grain. The miller promises flour. The baker promises bread. The seller promises honesty. The society promises that the poor will not be fed poison disguised as food. When that contract breaks, bread becomes dark. Not because bread is evil, but because it is powerful. The more necessary a food becomes, the more devastating its corruption can be. The poisoned bread that fed the poor was not only a story of bad ingredients. It was the story of hunger being exploited, of whiteness being faked, of weight being added without nourishment, of trust being sold by the loaf, and of families discovering that the food they depended on might be slowly betraying them. So the next time you see bread, ordinary and quiet on a table, remember this. For most of history, bread was not guaranteed. Bread was work. Bread was weather. Bread was politics. Bread was survival. And when the poor had nothing else, they trusted the loaf. Sometimes that trust kept them alive. And sometimes it poisoned them. Part 11. The smell of honest bread. One reason bread fraud was so emotionally powerful is that people believed they knew bread by their senses. They knew the smell of a proper loaf, the feel of crust under the thumb, the color of crumb, the weight in the hand, the way it tore, the way it softened in soup. But adulteration attacked the senses themselves. A loaf could be engineered to look right while being wrong. It could smell acceptable while containing weak flour. It could feel heavy because something useless had been added. It could appear white because the whiteness had been forced. This is the humiliation of fake bread. It tells the eater that even experience may not protect them. The grandmother who knew how to judge dough could still be fooled by new tricks. The worker who knew the price of bread could still be cheated by weight. The child who trusted the loaf could still be fed emptiness. Food fraud becomes especially modern when it defeats ordinary knowledge. In older village life, people often knew who baked, who milled, and who grew. In the city, those relationships thinned. The loaf became anonymous, and anonymous food requires stronger trust. When that trust failed, people demanded protection, not because they had become weak, but because the food system had become too hidden for one family to inspect alone. Part 12. Why the poor could not simply choose better. A comfortable person might ask a simple question. Why did people buy bad bread? Why not choose another baker? Why not refuse suspicious loaves? But poverty removes clean choices. The cheapest bread may be the only bread within reach. The honest baker may be too expensive. The better market may be too far. A hungry child cannot wait for an investigation. A worker paid at the end of the day may buy whatever remains. A widow may know the bread is poor and still need it. This is why food history must be careful with judgment. The poor were not foolish because they ate adulterated bread. They were trapped inside an economy where bad food was made available to them and good food was priced away from them. The real question is not why they ate it. The real question is why any society allowed survival food to become a place for poison, fraud, and hidden hunger. The poison loaf is therefore not only a story about bakers. It is a story about who gets protected when food becomes dangerous, who is believed when they complain, who is blamed for being sick, who can demand purity, and who must swallow whatever is placed within reach. Part 13. The inspector enters the bakery. The arrival of the food inspector changed the meaning of the bakery. Before inspection, the bakery was a private space, a place of trade, skill, heat, and secrecy. After inspection, it became a public health site. The oven was no longer just an oven. The flour sack was no longer just property. The scales, bins, water, additives, and storage rooms became matters of public concern. This shift was enormous. It meant society had begun to admit that the buyer alone could not defend themselves. A poor mother could not chemically test flour. A worker could not inspect every mill. A child could not identify adulterants in a crust. Protection had to move upstream, into mills, markets, bakeries, laws, standards. Food safety became a collective responsibility because food danger was collective. One corrupt batch could feed an entire street. One contaminated mill could affect many bakeries. One dishonest practice could become normal if competitors copied it. The inspector, the chemist, and the public health reformer were not glamorous figures, but they stood at the edge of the table trying to make bread honest again. Part 14, the modern loaf and the old question. Today, most bread is far safer than the loaves of the adulteration age. Factories are inspected. Ingredients are listed. Flour is standardized. Microbial risks are better understood. But the old question has not vanished. What is real nourishment and what only looks like it? Modern bread may not contain chalk, but modern consumers still live in a world of cheap calories, refined starches, additives, marketing, and confusion. The problem has changed shape. In the past, a loaf might be bulked out with dangerous fillers. Today, a product may be safe in the immediate sense, but still designed more for shelf life, softness, profit, and craving than deep nourishment. This does not mean modern bread is poison. It means the moral history of bread continues. Bread still asks what society owes the people who depend on basic foods: honesty, safety, access, dignity. The loaf remains humble but never simple. It carries the memory of hunger, fraud, reform, and trust. And the poorest families still deserve the same thing they deserved centuries ago. Not the appearance of food, food itself. This was the dark history of the poisoned bread that fed the poor.